The year of our Lord 1887 smelled of dust, piety, and decay, a scent that clung to the town of Salvation's Ridge like a shroud, tucked into a fold of the Colorado Rockies. The town lived by two unwavering tenets: the Word of God as interpreted by Reverend Michael, and the unspoken laws of survival that were far harsher than any scripture. For a woman like Eleanor Vance, these laws were written on the faces of every person she passed on the dusty main street. They were etched in the tight-lipped nods of the women and the lingering, speculative gazes of the men. Eleanor was a widow, a title that in Salvation's Ridge was less a statement of loss and more an accusation. She lived in a small, tidy cabin at the very edge of town, where the proper settlement gave way to wind-swept prairie grass and the shadow of the mountains. The location was a perfect metaphor for her existence, connected but not included, seen but not known. Her husband, Thomas, had been a man of grand dreams and poor judgment. He had chased a seam of gold into the belly of the earth, and the earth had claimed him for its own. A rockfall snuffing out his life and leaving Eleanor with a mountain of debt and a reputation as tarnished as a cheap tin plate. The whispers followed her from the general store to the post office. They said Thomas had been a fool, but that she, Eleanor, was cursed. She was the woman who brought ruin, bad luck. They murmured behind their hands as she bought her flour and thread. Look at her, proud as you please. But she sent a good man to his grave. The fact that Thomas's goodness had been liberally seasoned with whiskey and a fondness for cards was conveniently forgotten. In death, he became a martyr to his widow's ill fortune. So Eleanor retreated. Her world shrank to the four walls of her cabin, to the rhythmic push and pull of her needle, the soft whisper of thread through calico and wool. She was a seamstress, and a fine one at that. Her stitches were small and even, her cuts precise. The very women who shunned her in public would send their daughters to her door with fabric for a new church dress or a husband's shirt to be mended. They paid her in coin or chickens, their transactions brisk and businesslike, their eyes avoiding hers. They did not want her curse to seep into the seams of their garments. Eleanor bore it all with a quiet, unyielding grace that the town mistook for arrogance. She was 28, but the lines of grief and solitude had begun to map her face, giving her a solemn beauty that was both striking and intimidating. She had learned to hold her head high, to meet stares with a calm, level gaze that gave nothing away. Inside, however, a profound loneliness had taken root, a silent ache that worsened with every sunset she watched alone from her small porch, her gaze drifting across the valley. Directly across that valley, on a sprawling piece of land that wrestled with the wilderness and mostly won, was Jacob's ranch. The place had no name, known only by its owners. Jacob was as much a feature of the landscape as the jagged peaks behind him, tall, broad-shouldered, and weathered by the sun, and a past he never spoke of. He'd come to the valley 5 years ago, a former soldier with haunted eyes and enough money to buy the old McGregor plot. He worked the land with a fierce, single-minded determination, his silence as vast as the sky above his fields. He hired men for the planting and the harvest, rough hands who came for the work and the fair pay, and left when the job was done. They respected him for his strength and his fairness, but no one could claim to know him. He kept to himself, his only companions a sturdy horse and a hound with one floppy ear. He lived in a house he'd built with his own hands, a solid, unadorned structure of timber and stone that stood against the wind like its master. From his porch, Jacob could see the whole of Salvation's Ridge, a miniature collection of boxes and spires in the distance, and on the very edge of that collection, he could just make out a pinprick of light that appeared each evening. It was Eleanor Vance's lamp. He had seen her in town on his rare trips for supplies. He'd seen the way the townsfolk parted for her, the way she moved through them like a ghost, untouchable and isolated. He recognized the look in her eyes. It was a mirror of the emptiness he saw in his own reflection each morning. He, too, was a pariah of a different sort, A man who had seen too much of the world's violence to ever feel comfortable with the small-minded cruelties of town life. He was alone by choice, she by circumstance, yet the result was the same. One crisp autumn evening, as Jacob sat cleaning a rifle on his porch, the weekly mail delivery brought a letter that was not a bill or a notice from the land office. It was from a matrimonial agency in St. Louis, a response to an inquiry he had made months ago in a moment of profound, whiskey-fueled loneliness. The letter was formal and direct. It spoke of a young woman of good character and strong constitution, seeking a husband and a life in the West. Her name was Clara. Jacob read the letter twice, his face impassive. The idea of a wife was, for him, a practical one. The house was too quiet. The winters were too long. He was 35, and the labor of the ranch was beginning to settle in his bones in a way it hadn't a few years prior. He needed a helpmate, someone to manage the house, to bring order and perhaps a measure of warmth to his stark existence. He did not think of love. Love was a casualty of the war he'd fought, a sentiment buried somewhere in the blood-soaked soil of the South. He thought of stability. He thought of an end to the crushing silence. He wrote back the next day, his hand steady and his words concise. He enclosed the requested funds for her passage and agreed to the arrangement. He would marry the mail-order bride named Clara. He would be a good husband, providing and protecting her as was his duty. He folded the letter, sealed it, and for a moment, his eyes drifted across the valley to the small light that had just blinked on at the edge of town. He felt a strange, inexplicable pang of something he couldn't name, and quickly dismissed it. This was a transaction, a necessary step, nothing more. Weeks turned into a month, and the vibrant colors of autumn bled into the stark gray of approaching winter. A letter arrived confirming the date of arrival. Clara would be on the Tuesday stagecoach, and she would not be alone. She was traveling with her older sister, Ruth, who would act as her chaperone and help her settle before returning east. Jacob accepted the news with a grunt. 2 women were more complicated than one, but it was a temporary arrangement. He prepared the small room at the back of the house, fitting it with a simple bed and a washstand. It felt strange to be preparing for a presence, a life, that was utterly alien to him. The Tuesday of their arrival dawned with a sky the color of a fresh bruise. By midday, a cold, spitting rain had begun to fall, turning the hard-packed earth to a thick, greedy mud. Jacob hitched his wagon and rode toward town, his hat pulled low against the wind that howled down from the mountains. The weather suited his mood, grim and unsettled. He was a man who valued predictability, and he was about to invite chaos into the heart of his orderly world. As he neared Salvation's Ridge, the rain intensified, coming down in near-solid sheets that blurred the world into a wash of gray and brown. The stagecoach would be late. He pulled his wagon up near the livery stable, seeking what little shelter the overhang provided. The main street was deserted, save for a few souls hurrying between buildings, heads bent against the storm. And then he saw her. Eleanor Vance was standing under the narrow porch of the general store, a heavy basket clutched in her hands. A thick wool shawl covered her head and shoulders, but the wind whipped strands of dark hair across her face. She wasn't looking at him. Her attention was fixed on a small house down a muddy side street, the home of Martha, an elderly woman who had once been a housekeeper for Thomas's uncle. Eleanor often brought the woman scraps of fabric and, when she could afford it, a bit of extra food. It was an act of quiet charity no one in town knew or cared about. She seemed to be waiting for a break in the downpour, a small, still figure against the fury of the storm. Jacob watched her, unobserved. He saw the tension in her posture, the resolute set of her jaw. She was not fragile. She was like a lone pine on a high ridge, weathered and bent by the elements, but not broken. Her resilience called to something deep within him, a silent recognition of a shared strength forged in hardship. Just then, the telltale rumble and splash of the stagecoach echoed down the street. It appeared out of the deluge, a lumbering beast caked in mud, drawn by 4 exhausted horses. It skidded to a halt in front of the town's only hotel, its wheels sinking into the muck. The driver, a man wrapped in oilskins, swung down and wrestled with the door. Jacob moved from the shelter of the livery, pulling his collar up against the rain. This was it, the moment of transaction. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach. A few curious faces appeared in the windows of the hotel and the saloon. The arrival of the stage was always an event, and the arrival of 2 new women in a storm was high drama. The door swung open, and the first to emerge was a young woman, helped down by the driver. This had to be Clara. Even in the gloom of the storm, her beauty was undeniable. She had hair the color of spun gold, currently damp and plastered to her head, and wide blue eyes that scanned the bleak surroundings with a mixture of fear and defiance. She was young, perhaps not yet 20, and she held herself with a rigid straightness that hinted at a will of iron beneath the delicate features. She wore a simple, travel-worn dress, but it could not hide the grace of her form. Behind her, another woman descended, moving with less haste and more deliberation. This was Ruth. She was taller than her sister, and plainer, though her face had a calm, classical structure that was handsome in its own right. Her hair was a sensible brown, pulled back tightly, and her eyes were a deep, steady gray, where Clara seemed to radiate a nervous energy. Ruth was a pool of quiet composure. She took in the scene, the muddy street, the grim-faced man approaching them, the few watching faces with a single, sweeping glance that seemed to miss nothing. She placed a protective hand on her sister's arm. Jacob stopped before them, removing his hat as rain plastered his dark hair to his scalp. "Miss Clara?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. The blonde girl, Clara, jerked her head up, her blue eyes fixing on him. There was a flicker of appraisal, of something that might have been disappointment or simply exhaustion. "I am Clara," she said, her voice clear but strained. "And this is my sister, Ruth. You are Mr. Jacob?" "I am," he confirmed, nodding to both of them. "Welcome to Salvation's Ridge. It's a hard journey. The wagon is over here. We'll get your things and get you out of this storm." Clara gave a curt nod, shivering, while Ruth murmured a quiet, "Thank you, sir." Jacob's attention was divided. He was assessing the woman he had agreed to marry, this beautiful, steely-eyed girl who looked as out of place as a porcelain doll in a pigsty. He was noting the older sister, the silent guardian whose gaze felt far older than her years. He was aware of his duty, of the promises made in his letter. But his eyes were not on them. As he turned to help the driver with their trunks, his gaze was pulled, as if by an invisible string. Across the street, Eleanor Vance had finally decided to brave the rain. With her basket held tight, she had stepped out from under the porch and was now making her way toward Martha's cottage, her head bowed against the wind. The storm seemed to press in on her, trying to force her back, but she moved with a steady, determined pace. And in that moment, she looked up. Perhaps she felt his stare, a sudden warmth in the freezing rain. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, met his across the muddy expanse. The world seemed to fall away. The hammering rain, the snorting horses, the 2 strange women at his side, it all faded into a dull, distant roar. All he saw was her. He saw the flicker of surprise in her expression, the instant recognition, the subtle tensing of her shoulders as she acknowledged the man from across the valley. There was no artifice in her look, no judgment, no pity. There was only a shared, profound understanding that passed between them in a heartbeat, a silent communion of 2 solitary souls caught in the same storm. He had seen her 100 times from a distance, a figure of sorrow and defiance, but seeing her now, up close, her face pale and rain-slicked, her eyes holding his, he felt a jolt that went deeper than duty, deeper than loneliness, deeper than any wound the war had left him. It was a feeling he had thought long dead. A shiver from Clara at his elbow broke the spell. "Mr. Jacob? The trunks?" Jacob tore his gaze away from Eleanor, the connection snapping like a frayed rope. He turned back to his duties, his face a mask of stone. "Yes, of course." He hefted a heavy trunk onto his shoulder, the muscles in his back bunching with the effort. He did not look across the street again, but he was acutely aware of her. He could feel her presence as she disappeared down the side street, a fleeting shadow swallowed by the storm. He had just welcomed his future into his life. He had purchased a bride, a partner to build a life with. But as he led the two sisters to his wagon, their faces pale and anxious in the fading light, his mind was filled with the image of another woman, a widow with eyes like a winter sky, a woman who carried her curse with the grace of a crown, a woman he had only ever known from a distance, until this one rain-lashed moment. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the transaction he had made had just become impossibly, terrifyingly complicated. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as stark and demanding as the landscape itself. For Clara, the ranch was a wilderness not of nature, but of silence. The vast, open sky that Jacob seemed to draw strength from felt to her like a suffocating bell jar. The wind, his constant companion, sounded to her like a mournful cry, echoing the desolation in her own heart. She tried. She swept the rough-hewn floors, kneaded bread until her soft hands were raw, and attempted to mend Jacob's work clothes, her stitches clumsy and uneven next to the ghost of some previous, more expert hand. Jacob was not an unkind man. He was, in fact, impeccably polite. He spoke to her in quiet, measured tones, asking if she was warm enough, if she needed anything from town. He provided for her and her sister without complaint. But his courtesy was a wall of solid ice. His eyes, when they rested on her, were distant, as if looking at a piece of furniture he had acquired and was still deciding where to place. There was no warmth, no curiosity, no spark of the intimacy she had been led to expect, or perhaps to fear. He was a dutiful stranger, and each polite, empty gesture was a fresh wound. At night, in the small room she shared with her sister, the facade would crumble. Ruth would pretend to be asleep as Clara's silent sobs shook the small rope bed. She wept for the life she had lost in Ohio, for the family that had sold her into this arrangement to settle a debt, for the beautiful, fragile dream of a new beginning that was dissolving into this hard, lonely reality. She had been delivered like a parcel, and she felt just as inanimate, just as unvalued. Ruth was the silent gear that kept the household turning. She rose before dawn, her movements efficient and sure. She coaxed the stubborn stove to life, cooked meals that were simple but nourishing, and brought a semblance of order to the masculine chaos of Jacob's home. She would soothe Clara's anxieties with a calm word or a steadying hand, her presence a quiet anchor in her sister's turbulent sea of emotions, and all the while, she watched Jacob. Her gaze was not the longing look of a suitor, but the intense, analytical stare of a scholar studying a difficult text. She observed the way his shoulders tensed when he came in from the fields, the way his eyes would drift across the valley toward Salvation's Ridge, the way a profound weariness seemed to settle on him when he thought no one was looking. She saw a man as trapped as her sister, albeit in a prison of his own making. For Eleanor, life continued in its well-worn groove of isolation. The arrival of the mail-order bride and her sister was the talk of the town, a fresh topic for the sewing circles and the gossips at the general store. The whispers now had a new target, but Eleanor felt no relief. The town's judgment was a fickle beast. It would turn back to her soon enough. She kept to her work, the rhythmic prick of the needle a familiar comfort. Her small lamp was a solitary beacon against the encroaching winter darkness, a darkness that seemed to seep into the very marrow of her bones. One afternoon, a shadow fell across her doorway. She looked up from her work, her fingers still, her heart giving a sudden, sharp jolt. It was Jacob. He stood on her threshold, his large frame filling the entrance, his hat held in his hands. He looked out of place. a creature of the wild mountains brought into her small, contained world. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice low and hesitant. It was the first time he had ever spoken her name. "Mr. Jacob," she replied, her own voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "What can I do for you?" I need a winter coat," he said, the words sounding clumsy and rehearsed. "A heavy one. Wool, if you have it. The one I have is worn through." It was a plausible request, yet they both knew it was a pretense. He could have sent one of his seasonal hands, or asked his new fiancée to inquire in town. Coming himself was a deliberate act, a crossing of a line that had been silently understood between them for years. Eleanor nodded slowly, rising from her chair. "I have some fine thick wool that came in on the last supply wagon. It would serve you well against the wind up on the ridge." She moved to a chest in the corner, her back to him, keenly aware of his presence behind her. The air in the small cabin was suddenly thick, charged with unspoken things. She pulled out a bolt of dark gray wool, the color of a stormy sea, and laid it on her work table. "This will do," she said, her professional tone a fragile shield. He stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He ran a hand over the fabric, his fingers calloused and rough against the soft material. "It's good quality." "I only stock the best," she said quietly. An awkward silence fell between them. Jacob did not seem to be in any hurry to leave. His gaze roamed her small cabin, taking in the neat stacks of fabric, the spools of thread arranged by color, the single, worn armchair by the hearth. It was a lonely room, but it was not a sad one. It was a space of quiet resilience, of a life pared down to its essentials. "It must get quiet out here," he said, his voice softer now. Eleanor met his gaze. The pretense was gone. "I'm used to the quiet," she answered. "I imagine you are, too." He gave a slow nod. "The quiet is better than the noise." "Sometimes." He looked at her then, a direct, searching look that seemed to peel back the layers of polite society and see the raw truth of her. "The war, it was a loud affair. I came out here seeking the opposite." It was the most he had ever revealed of himself to anyone in the valley. The admission hung in the air between them, a fragile offering. Eleanor felt a crack in the careful wall she had built around her heart. Here was a man who understood that solitude was not always a punishment. "My husband, he did not like the quiet," she found herself saying, the words coming out in a near whisper. He needed noise, laughter, the sound of cards being shuffled, the clink of glasses. She stopped, surprised at her own candor. She never spoke of Thomas. "Some men are like that," Jacob said, his voice gentle, devoid of judgment. "They fear what they'll hear if the world ever stops talking." Eleanor looked down at her hands, resting on the dark wool. "The town, they have their own ideas about me, about Thomas." "I don't listen to the town," Jacob stated simply. It was not a defense of her, but a statement of fact about himself. And in that, it was the greatest comfort anyone had offered her in years. He saw her not as the widow Vance, the bringer of bad luck, but as a person, separate from the stories that clung to her. She was drawn to this man's stillness, to the deep well of understanding she sensed behind his haunted eyes. For a few moments, in the quiet of her cabin, she did not feel like a pariah. She felt seen. He stayed for a while longer, making arrangements for the measurements and the fitting. The conversation remained simple, circling the practicalities of the coat, but the undercurrent of shared understanding flowed beneath every word. When he finally left, stepping back out into the cold afternoon, Eleanor felt his absence like a physical thing. The cabin, her sanctuary, suddenly felt immensely empty. Clara saw the change in Jacob when he returned. It was subtle, a slight easing of the tension in his shoulders, a new light in his eyes when he looked out across the valley. He was still quiet, still distant with her, but there was a new energy about him, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with the ranch or with her. She knew, with a woman's intuition that was as sharp as it was painful, that it had to do with the widow at the edge of town. A bitter seed of jealousy began to sprout, tangled with the guilt of her own inadequacy. She was to be his wife, yet a single visit to another woman had animated him more than her presence over weeks had. Ruth saw it too, but where Clara felt jealousy, Ruth felt a detached, sorrowful clarity. She saw the lines of the problem with a stark geometry. Jacob, a man wounded by a past he couldn't speak of. Eleanor, a woman ostracized by a town that couldn't forgive. And Clara, her own beloved sister, a pawn in a transaction that had no room for emotion. Three broken people, pushed together by circumstance, pulling apart by the laws of the heart. The wedding date had been set before Clara's arrival. It was to be a simple affair in 2 weeks' time. As the day drew nearer, the tension on the ranch became almost unbearable. Jacob grew more withdrawn, his silences deeper and heavier. Clara retreated into a state of nervous despair, her weeping fits more frequent. Only Ruth remained constant, her calm efficiency a rock in the churning emotional tides. One night, the moon was a perfect silver dollar in a sky of black velvet. Unable to sleep, Ruth slipped out of the house, seeking the clean, cold air. She walked past the barn and toward the outer corral, the moonlight casting long, skeletal shadows from the fence posts. It was then that she heard voices, a low murmur, barely audible over the chirping of the crickets. She froze, melting back into the deep shadow of the barn wall. Peeking around the edge, she saw them. Jacob and Eleanor were standing near the fence line that marked the edge of his property, the place where his land began its slow descent into the valley. It was the halfway point between their two worlds. Eleanor must have walked up from her cabin, and he had come out to meet her. Ruth could not hear their words, only the cadence of their voices, low, pained, and urgent. They stood a few feet apart, a chasm of propriety and impossibility between them. Ruth watched as Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture of self-protection. She saw Jacob take a half-step forward, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He was a man at war with himself. Then, as if moved by a force beyond his control, he reached out. He did not touch her arm or her shoulder. He simply laid his large, calloused hand over hers, where it was clutching her shawl. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, of aching restraint. Eleanor did not pull away. She looked up at him, her face a pale oval in the moonlight, and Ruth could see the glistening of tears on her cheeks. Their eyes held, and in that shared gaze was a universe of longing, of sorrow, of what could never be. It was a silent, heartbreaking confession. Quietly, Ruth retreated, her heart a heavy stone in her chest. She now knew the full, impossible truth. She had seen it with her own eyes. The wedding day was cold and bright. Clara wore a simple white dress that Ruth had helped her make, the fine stitches a testament to her sister's quiet devotion. She looked ethereal, a fragile snowdrop of a bride. Jacob stood beside her before Reverend Michael, his face carved from granite. He spoke his vows in a clear, steady voice, the words of a man honoring a contract. Clara's responses were a whispered breath of air. The town watched, their eyes greedy for drama, and were disappointed by the somber, joyless efficiency of the ceremony. That night, in the master bedroom Jacob had cleared for them, the coldness of the ceremony followed them. The room was clean and sparse, dominated by a large wooden bedstead. A lamp burned low on the nightstand, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her hands twisted in her lap, her body rigid with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Perhaps now, with the vows spoken, things would change. Perhaps now he would see her as his wife. Jacob entered the room and closed the door softly behind him. He did not look at her. He walked to the washstand and poured water into the basin. methodically washing his face and hands. He moved with the slow, deliberate actions of a man delaying an execution. Finally, he turned, his face unreadable in the dim light. "You should get some rest, Clara," he said, his voice flat. It was a long day. He blew out the lamp, plunging the room into near total darkness, save for the pale rectangle of moonlight from the window. He undressed in the shadows and slipped into his side of the bed, the ropes creaking under his weight. He lay on his back, staring up at the ceiling, his body a stiff, unmoving line a world away from hers. Clara waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. She waited for a touch, a word, a sign that she was anything more than an object in his house. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. An hour passed, then another. The only sound was the wind outside and the steady, separate rhythm of their breathing. He made no move toward her. Finally, a single hot tear escaped and traced a path down her temple, then another. Soon, her whole body was shaking with silent, suppressed sobs. She turned onto her side, her back to him, pulling the quilt up to muffle the sound. Her grief a raw, physical agony. She was married, she was a wife, and she had never felt more alone. Later, in the deepest part of the night, the bedroom door creaked open. A soft footstep fell on the floor. A figure knelt beside Clara's side of the bed. It was Ruth. She had heard the weeping her sister had tried so desperately to hide. In the pale moonlight, Ruth could see the trembling of Clara's shoulders, could feel the waves of her misery. She reached out and laid a gentle hand on her sister's hair, stroking it softly. Clara flinched, then relaxed into the familiar, comforting touch. The sobs became audible now, raw and broken. Ruth leaned in close, her lips near Clara's ear. She did not offer empty platitudes or false reassurances. She waited until the worst of the storm had passed, until Clara's weeping subsided into ragged, exhausted breaths. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, a thread of sound in the immense silence of the house, Ruth spoke. "I can help, if you want me to." The morning after the wedding was a masterpiece of cold pretense. Jacob rose before the sun, his movements quiet and deliberate, as if trying not to disturb a sleeping invalid. Clara lay still, her back to his side of the bed, feigning a deep slumber she had not for a moment possessed. She listened to the soft scrape of his razor, the splash of cold water, the heavy thud of his boots on the floor. He left the room without a word, and the silence he left behind was heavier than his presence had been. Downstairs, a fragile truce was observed. Ruth had already started the coffee, its bitter, earthy scent a small comfort in the frigid air. When Jacob entered the main room, he nodded to her, a gesture of acknowledgement between two soldiers on opposing sides of a ceasefire. "Morning," he grunted, pouring himself a cup. "Good morning, Jacob," Ruth replied, her voice even and calm. She did not ask after her sister. She did not need to. The answer was in the rigid set of his shoulders and the dark circles under his eyes. Jacob was a man being crushed between two immense, unmoving stones. On one side was duty. He had made a vow, a promise before God and the town. He had taken this young woman, Clara, under his protection. He had brought her 1,000 miles from her home to this harsh, unforgiving land. He owed her a home, safety, and a husband's care. His honor, the rigid code that had seen him through the war and the solitary years that followed, demanded it. He would not, could not, be the kind of man who broke his word. On the other side was Eleanor. She was not a duty. She was a force of nature, a magnetic pull he had been fighting since the day he first saw her. The moonlit encounter by the fence had shattered his defenses. The touch of her hand, the shared look of desolate understanding in her eyes, it had reawakened a part of him he had thought long dead and buried. He wanted to protect her, to stand between her and the town's cruel whispers, to see her smile without the shadow of sorrow in her eyes. This wanting was a raw, physical ache, a fire in his blood that his cold vows to Clara could not extinguish. The pressure of this internal war was immense. He threw himself into his work, laboring from dawn until dusk, seeking exhaustion as a way to numb the conflict raging within him. He was courteous to Clara, distant with Ruth, and haunted by the ghost of a woman across the valley. Eleanor, too, was in turmoil. The touch of Jacob's hand had been a brand, marking her with a hope that was both beautiful and terrifying. For a few stolen moments in the moonlight, she had not been the town pariah, the cursed widow. She had been a woman, seen and desired by a man she, in turn, felt an undeniable pull toward. But the dawn brought back the cold, hard facts of her life. He was married now. He belonged to another. To entertain any hope was to invite not only her own ruin, but the ruin of the innocent young bride he had brought home. Her conscience warred with her heart. Guilt was a bitter taste in her mouth. She was the other woman, the homewrecker, the very thing the town had always suspected her of being. To protect herself from the pain, and to create a barrier against any further contact with Jacob, she retreated into the only sanctuary she had, her work. When Ruth appeared at her door a few days later to commission 2 new day dresses, one for herself and one for Clara, Eleanor seized the opportunity like a drowning woman grabbing a piece of driftwood. It was the perfect excuse. She could remain connected to his world, but through a safe, professional transaction. The dresses would require fittings, consultations about fabric and trim. It would all be proper, businesslike. It would be a shield. "Of course," Eleanor had said, her voice betraying none of her inner chaos. "I would be happy to. Has your sister a preference for color?" Ruth, with her steady, all-seeing eyes, seemed to understand the unspoken dynamics. She became the go-between. She would ride to Eleanor's cabin alone for the fittings, bringing Clara's measurements and discussing fabric choices. During these visits, she began to weave a delicate, intricate web of conversation. She never mentioned Jacob directly. Instead, she spoke of life back in Ohio, of a neighbor who had lost her husband young and had to raise 3 children on her own. Her voice filled with admiration for the woman's strength. She told a story of an aunt who had never married, choosing instead to run a small bookshop, a woman who found her companionship in stories rather than in a man. These were not idle tales. Each one was a carefully chosen seed, planted in the fertile ground of Eleanor's loneliness. She was testing the soil, seeing if Eleanor would open up, if she would recognize herself in these portraits of resilient, solitary women. Eleanor, starved for genuine human connection, found herself listening intently. She had spent years in a conversational desert, and Ruth's words were like a gentle spring rain. She began to respond, cautiously at first, then with more candor. She spoke of the challenges of her trade, of the loneliness of the long winter nights, of the small, quiet joys she found in a perfectly executed stitch or the beauty of a sunset. In Ruth, she did not find pity or judgment, but a quiet, profound empathy. She found a listener. One late afternoon, a week before the dresses were due to be finished, the sky opened up. A cold, relentless autumn rain began to fall, turning the valley into a sea of mud. It was the kind of storm that promised to last for hours, perhaps even through the night. Just as dusk was settling, there was a knock on Eleanor's door. It was Ruth, soaked through, a heavy oilskin cloak dripping onto the porch. "Forgive the intrusion, Eleanor," she said, her voice calm despite her drenched state. "I came to collect Clara's dress for her final fitting, but this storm caught me. I fear the creek will be impassable soon. Would it be too much of an imposition to wait here until it lessens?" "Of course not. Come in, for heaven's sake. You'll catch your death," Eleanor said, her concern genuine. She ushered Ruth inside, bustling to take her wet cloak and hang it by the hearth. The cabin, usually a fortress of solitude, suddenly felt warm and alive with the presence of another. Eleanor put a kettle on the stove for tea and laid out a small plate of biscuits she had baked that morning. The rain hammered against the roof, and the wind howled around the small cabin. But inside, a fragile bubble of warmth and safety formed around the two women. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping their hot tea, listening to the storm. It was Ruth who broke the silence, her voice soft and contemplative. "This rain, it makes the world feel very small, doesn't it?" Eleanor looked into the fire. "Sometimes that's a comfort. And sometimes it's a cage," Ruth added quietly. She looked at Eleanor, her gray eyes direct and full of an unspoken understanding. "My sister, she feels like she's in a cage. This life is not what she expected." Eleanor's heart clenched. "She is very young." "She is," Ruth agreed. "And she was raised to believe that a husband is the beginning and end of a woman's world, that love and happiness are guaranteed by a vow." She paused, taking a slow sip of her tea. "I was never convinced. I have seen too many women find that the man they married was a stranger, and the home he gave them was just a prettier cage." The words hung in the air, a raw and honest confession that resonated deep within Eleanor's soul. "Thomas, my husband, he was not a stranger when I married him," she heard herself say, the words tasting of old grief. "But he became one, or perhaps he was one all along, and I simply refused to see it. He filled this house with his wants, his needs, his disappointments. There was no room left for me. When he was gone, as much as I mourned him, there was also a quiet, a space to breathe." She looked up at Ruth, her eyes wide with the shock of her own admission. "That is a terrible thing to say." "It is an honest thing to say," Ruth corrected gently. "Honesty is never terrible. It is merely true." They spoke for what felt like hours, their conversation weaving through the labyrinth of their lives. They spoke of loneliness, of the expectations placed upon them as women, of the small ways they had learned to survive in a world built for men. Eleanor found herself confessing her fears, her deep-seated belief that she was somehow cursed, that she was destined to be alone. Ruth listened, not with platitudes, but with an intensity that made Eleanor feel as if she were the only person in the world. The storm showed no sign of abating. The fire had burned low, and the cabin was filled with a warm, intimate glow. Ruth stood up and walked to the hearth to add another log. When she turned back, her expression had shifted. The quiet empathy had been replaced by something else, something deeper and more intense. She slowly unbuttoned her damp outer bodice, laying it carefully over the back of a chair to dry. She stood before Eleanor in just her chemise and skirt, her form silhouetted against the firelight. She took a step closer, then another, until she was standing directly in front of where Eleanor sat. The air crackled with a new tension, a silent question. Ruth's gaze was unwavering, a mixture of profound compassion and a bold, startling inquiry. Slowly, as if testing the air, she reached out. Her fingers did not go to Eleanor's hand or her shoulder. They went to the simple, worn fabric of Eleanor's dress, brushing against the hem of her sleeve. It was the lightest of touches, a feather stroke against her skin. But it sent a shock wave through Eleanor's entire body. It was a test, an invitation, a question asked without words. Eleanor's breath hitched. Every instinct, conditioned by years of caution and fear, screamed at her to pull back, to retreat into her shell. But she did not. She looked into Ruth's eyes and saw not a threat, but a reflection of her own profound loneliness, her own deep yearning for a safe harbor. She did not move. She did not flinch. She gave her answer in her stillness, seeing the acceptance in her eyes. Ruth moved closer still. She knelt before Eleanor, taking her hands in her own. They were both trembling. Gently, Ruth brought Eleanor to her feet. Then, with a tenderness that was utterly overwhelming, she wrapped her arms around the widow. Eleanor stood frozen for a moment. Then a shudder ran through her, a sob that was part grief, part relief. She collapsed against Ruth, her arms circling the other woman's back, clinging to her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was spinning apart. They held each other, two women adrift, finding an anchor in the storm. It was not a carnal embrace, not a touch of base desire. It was something far more elemental. It was the profound, soul-deep relief of being held, of being understood, of feeling, for the first time in a very, very long time, completely and utterly safe. From the window of his barn, where he'd been checking on a restless horse, Jacob saw the light in Eleanor's cabin. He stood in the darkness for a long time, watching the small, defiant square of yellow against the black, raging storm. He was turning to go back to the house when her cabin door opened. A figure emerged, wrapped in a dark cloak, and hurried away into the night, heading back up the trail toward his ranch. It was Ruth. Jacob stood perfectly still, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat, a cold knot tightening in his gut. He did not know what he had just seen. He did not know why Ruth would be at Eleanor's cabin so late, in such a storm. His mind, already a battlefield, was now plagued by a new, shapeless enemy of suspicion and confusion. He said nothing. He just stood in the darkness and watched the light in Eleanor's window until it was extinguished. A few days later, while tidying the small room she and Ruth still shared, Clara's hand brushed against a loose floorboard beneath her sister's cot. Curious, she lifted it. Tucked inside was a small, leather-bound journal. She knew she shouldn't, but a desperate, gnawing need to understand the silent currents that were pulling her new life apart compelled her. She opened it. Tucked between the pages was a folded piece of paper, a letter that had been started but never finished. The handwriting was Ruth's. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It was a fragment, a thought captured on paper. It read, "He watches her from across the valley. He does not see you. This bargain has brought nothing but pain. If you cannot make him happy, if this life is not a life at all, I will help." The words were a dagger in Clara's heart. I will help. How? Help her leave, help her win his affection, or something else entirely. A cold dread washed over her. That night, when Ruth came to their room to sleep, Clara was waiting, the piece of paper held in her trembling hand.
"What is this, Ruth?"
she asked, her voice a raw whisper. Ruth looked at the paper, then at her sister's pale, tear-streaked face. She did not deny it. Her expression was one of deep sorrow, but no guilt. "It is a thought I had," she said simply. "I will help," Clara pressed, her voice breaking. "Help how? Do you pity me so much? Do you think I am so weak?" The jealousy, the fear, the humiliation of the past weeks boiled over. "Or is it him? Do you want him for yourself?" Ruth was silent for a long moment, her calm gaze never leaving Clara's. Then she took a step forward. "It is not about wanting him, little sister." "Then what is it about?" Clara cried, her control shattering. A new, terrible thought, born from the confusion and the strange new alliances she could feel forming around her, clawed its way into her mind. "The widow, you spend so much time with her. What is it you see in her?" She took a shaky breath, the question she was terrified to ask finally forming on her lips. "Is it that you love him? Or is it that you love both of them, him and her?" The question, wild and impossible, hung in the air between them. Ruth did not answer with words. She simply closed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around her weeping, shattered sister. Clara stood rigid for a moment, ready to push her away, to fight, but the embrace was not one of pity. It was firm, protective, an echo of the embrace she had given Eleanor in the storm. It was an embrace that said, "You are not my rival. You are my sister. We are in this together." Slowly, the fight went out of Clara. She sagged against Ruth, her own arms coming up to weakly hold onto her sister's back. She let the tears come. and in the safety of her sister's arms. A revolutionary thought dawned. Her sister's love was not a threat, it was a shield. The widow's pain was not a judgment on her, but a mirror of her own. She was not in a competition, and perhaps, just perhaps, if she chose to share the burden of this impossible life, she would no longer have to carry it alone. The uneasy peace forged in the wake of Clara's discovery was a fragile, crystalline thing. It was a truth acknowledged but not yet understood. A new map of their world whose territories were still unnamed. Clara no longer wept at night. Instead, she and Ruth would talk in low whispers, their heads close together in the darkness, forging a new and profound alliance from the wreckage of the old one. Jacob, feeling the shift in the house's emotional climate without comprehending its cause, retreated further into himself. The house was no longer a place of open hostility, but of a watchful, waiting silence that was somehow more unnerving. The first public sign of this new alignment came on a brisk market day in Salvation's Ridge. It was customary for Ruth or Jacob to go into town for supplies, while Clara, shrinking from the curious stares, remained at the ranch. But on this day, Ruth went to Eleanor's cabin first, and when the two women walked onto the main street together, a perceptible ripple went through the town. It was one thing for the spinster sister of the mail-order bride to visit the pariah widow on business. It was another thing entirely for them to appear in public as companions. They moved with an easy, unhurried grace, stopping at the mercantile to purchase flour and salt, their heads bent together in quiet conversation. Then they went to the fabric stall, where they spent a long time examining bolts of calico and flannel. Mrs. Henderson, the Reverend's wife and the town's chief purveyor of gossip, watched from across the street, her lips pursed into a thin, disapproving line. She saw the way Ruth's hand brushed Eleanor's as they passed a bolt of fabric between them. She saw the genuine, unguarded smile that touched Eleanor's lips, a smile no one in Salvation's Ridge had seen in years. She saw the quiet, knowing look they exchanged, a look of deep and intimate understanding that was utterly baffling and, therefore, deeply suspect. Unnatural. Mrs. Henderson murmured to the woman beside her, "The widow and the spinster. What devil's bargain have they struck? I wonder." The whispers followed them from stall to stall. The women of the town, who had once offered Eleanor a cold, grudging respect for her quiet suffering, now saw her as a predator. She had not been content to live with her curse alone. Now she was drawing the innocent sister of Jacob's new wife into her web. They saw Ruth not as a companion, but as a victim. The looks they cast were a mixture of pity for Ruth and renewed venom for Eleanor. Eleanor felt the stares like a physical blow. The old shame, the familiar feeling of being judged and found wanting, rose in her throat. Her instinct was to flee, to retreat to the safety of her cabin. But then she felt Ruth's presence beside her, solid and unwavering. Ruth did not flinch from the stares. She met them with a calm, level gaze that offered no apology and no explanation. Her strength became Eleanor's. For the first time, Eleanor did not bow her head. She lifted it, and in that small act of defiance, a bond between the two women was forged in the fire of public opinion. But the past has a way of rising from its grave when it smells a moment of weakness. As Eleanor and Ruth were preparing to part ways at the edge of town, a man stepped out from the alley beside the saloon, blocking their path. He was of medium height, with a soft, fleshy face and small, cunning eyes that seemed to take in everything and value nothing. He wore a derby hat and a suit that was a little too fine for Salvation's Ridge, and he chewed on a toothpick with an air of lazy arrogance. Eleanor froze. The basket of goods nearly slipped from her grasp. A cold dread, colder than any winter wind, washed over her. She knew this man. "Silas," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "Well now, Ellie, you remember me," he said, a smug, unpleasant smile spreading across his face. His eyes flickered over to Ruth, taking in her plain dress and steady gaze with a dismissive glance. Before returning to Eleanor, "You're looking, well, widowhood seems to agree with you, though I always said you were made for finer things than being some dirt-scratcher's wife." Silas Croft had been a clerk in the mining office when Thomas was still alive. He had a way with words and a wallet that was always mysteriously full. He had paid court to Eleanor before she'd met Thomas, showering her with cheap compliments and possessive glances she had found deeply unsettling. She had rebuffed him, firmly and repeatedly, a fact his pride had never allowed him to accept. After Thomas's death, he had made a final, crude proposition, offering to take care of her and her debts. When she had thrown him out of her cabin, he had left town, but not before spreading a few choice rumors about her character.
What are you doing here, Silas?
Eleanor asked, her voice tight. "Business, my dear. Always business," he said, his eyes roaming over her. "But I find myself a little short of capital, and I thought of you. I remembered how generous you can be, and I remembered a few things about our time together. Stories that this pious little town might find very interesting. Stories about a young woman, not yet married, who wasn't quite as virtuous as she pretended to be. It was a lie, a complete and venomous fabrication. But Eleanor knew that in Salvation's Ridge, the truth was a poor defense against a good story. Ruth stepped forward slightly, placing herself between Silas and Eleanor. "State your business, sir, or be on your way." Silas's eyes narrowed at Ruth. "This doesn't concern you, spinster. This is a private matter between me and Ellie." He looked back at Eleanor, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. $100. That's all. $100. And your past stays in the past. Otherwise, I might feel compelled to share my memories with your new friend's brother-in-law, the big silent soldier. A man like that values a wife's reputation, doesn't he? The threat was clear, and it was devastating. He was not just threatening her reputation. He was threatening to destroy the fragile, unspoken connection she had with Jacob. He was threatening to poison the only well of kindness she had found in this desert. Tears of helpless rage burned in Eleanor's eyes. She didn't have $100? She barely had $5. "I have no money," she said, her voice shaking. "You're a clever woman, Ellie. You'll find it," Silas said with a final, oily smile. "I'll be in town for a week. Don't keep me waiting." He tipped his hat and sauntered back toward the saloon, leaving a trail of cold fear in his wake. Ruth put a steadying arm around Eleanor's trembling shoulders. "Who was that man?"
"A ghost,"
Eleanor whispered, her face pale. "A ghost who wants to bury me for good." That night, the waiting silence at the ranch finally broke. Ruth, her face set with a grim determination, told Clara everything about the whispers in town, about Silas, about the threat of blackmail. Clara, who had been slowly emerging from her shell of self-pity, felt a surge of protective fury. This was not just an attack on Eleanor, it was an attack on them all, on the fragile sanctuary they were trying to build. The town's poison was seeping under their door, and Silas Croft was the viper carrying the venom. They found Jacob on the porch, staring out into the darkness, his customary post. For once, his gaze was not on Eleanor's cabin, but on the distant, glittering lights of the town, as if he, too, could sense the menace brewing there.
"Jacob,"
Clara said, her voice clear and stronger than he had ever heard it. He turned, surprised by her tone. Both sisters stood before him, united, their faces illuminated by the light spilling from the house. They were no longer two separate, unhappy women. They were a single, unyielding force. "We need to talk," Ruth said, leaving no room for argument. Inside, they sat at the long wooden table. The air was thick with unspoken words. It was Ruth who spoke first, laying out the situation with stark, simple clarity. She told him about Silas, about the blackmail, about the threat to Eleanor's reputation. Jacob listened, his hands clenched into fists on the table, a muscle twitching in his jaw. A cold, familiar rage began to build in him, the kind he hadn't felt since the war. It was the rage of a protector seeing a threat to someone he cared for. "He will be dealt with," Jacob said, his voice a low growl. "How?" Clara asked, her blue eyes pinning him in place. "Will you beat him? Threaten him? He will only spread his lies faster. This is not a problem that can be solved with your fists. Jacob, this is about the silence. Your silence." Jacob looked at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" "You have been silent since we arrived," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "You have hidden in your work, hidden behind your politeness. You brought me here to be your wife. Yet you are a stranger to me. And you look at Eleanor with the heart of a husband. But you hide that, too. This silence, it is a lie. And Silas's lies can only grow in the darkness of yours. You have to stop hiding. Jacob, you have to choose." The word hung in the air between them, sharp and final as a headsman's axe. "Choose. You cannot live like this, torn between your duty and your heart," Ruth added, her voice softer but no less firm. "It is not fair to Clara, it is not fair to Eleanor, and it is not fair to yourself. You must choose one of us, one life, or you must leave us both to find our own way." The ultimatum was delivered. The pressure that had been building inside Jacob for weeks finally found its breaking point. He looked from Clara's fierce, determined face to Ruth's calm, steady gaze. He saw not a bride and her sister, but two women of incredible strength, offering him not a trap, but an honest, painful way out. He let out a long, shuddering breath, the breath of a man surrendering after a long and brutal siege. He looked down at his hands, then back up at them, his eyes filled with a raw, agonizing honesty. "I have loved her since the first time I saw her," he confessed, the words torn from the deepest part of him. "Standing in the rain, before I even knew her name, I saw the strength in her, the loneliness. It was like looking at my own soul. But I had made a bargain. I had given my word." His gaze shifted to Clara, his eyes full of a deep, sorrowful regret. "I cannot hurt you, or you, Ruth. You are innocent in this. My choice. It has already harmed you both. I cannot choose a path that will cause you more pain." A profound silence descended on the room. It was not the tense, waiting silence of before, but a quiet, sad space where the truth could finally breathe. It was Clara who broke it. She reached across the table, her hand resting near his clenched fist. Though not touching it, her face was no longer angry. It was filled with a grace that was startling in its maturity. "I don't want to leave you, Jacob," she said, her voice soft but clear. "This land, it is hard, but it is my home now. But I cannot keep you like a possession, a husband I own but who does not own me in return. That is a prison, not a marriage." She took a breath, and her next words would change all of their lives forever. "If I must share your heart, I will not share it with a ghost, with the silence of what you truly want. I would rather share it with the woman herself." She looked from Jacob to her sister. "I choose to share you with someone who understands love and pain and what it means to be truly alone, because then none of us will be." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of release. Ruth moved behind her, placing her hands on Clara's shoulders and pressing a soft kiss to the top of her head, a gesture of profound love and solidarity. Then Ruth looked at Jacob, her eyes clear and commanding. "You don't have to choose, Jacob," she said, her voice resonating with a strange and powerful authority. "You have spent your whole life choosing between bad options, duty or death, silence or pain. Stop choosing. For once, just let love, in all its complicated and messy forms, speak for itself." A few nights later, a fragile peace had settled over the ranch house. The truth, once spoken, had cleared the air, leaving behind a raw and uncertain landscape. Jacob, Clara, and Ruth sat before the hearth. The fire crackled, casting a warm, dancing light on their faces. They did not speak, but the silence was different now. It was a shared silence, a space of contemplation. Suddenly, a hesitant knock came at the door. Jacob rose to open it. It was Eleanor. She stood on the threshold, a shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders, her face pale and etched with worry. Silas had cornered her again in town that day, his threats more insistent. She had come to Jacob as a last resort, to warn him, to tell him she would leave Salvation's Ridge if she had to protect him from the scandal. She saw Clara and Ruth sitting by the fire, and her instinct was to flee.
I'm sorry,
she stammered, taking a step back. I shouldn't have come. I'll go. She turned to leave, but a small hand shot out and grasped her wrist. It was Clara. She had risen from her chair and crossed the room in 2 quick steps. She held Eleanor's hand firmly, her grip surprisingly strong. Eleanor looked at the young bride, at the woman she had wronged in her heart 1,000 times, and saw no hatred, no jealousy in her eyes. She saw only a deep, sorrowful understanding. Clara pulled her gently but insistently into the room, toward the warmth of the fire. She led her to stand before Jacob, who stood as if rooted to the floor, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Then Clara leaned in close to Eleanor, her voice a fierce, determined whisper, the words that would become the foundation of their new world. I'll share him. Before Eleanor could process the impossible words, Ruth was there. She moved with a quiet, purposeful grace. She reached up and gently, reverently, untied the ribbon of the worn, formal dress Eleanor wore like a suit of armor, the dress of the respectable, sorrowful widow, the dress of her isolation. Ruth's fingers were deft and sure. She slipped the dress from Eleanor's shoulders, letting it pool at her feet on the floor. She stood in her simple chemise, vulnerable and exposed in the firelight. Then Ruth took Eleanor's hand and placed it in Jacob's, which was trembling slightly. She guided them to stand closer, 2 halves of a whole finally brought together. The fire crackled, spitting a shower of sparks. Outside, the wind howled, a lonely, wild sound, but inside the small cabin, surrounded by the warmth of the hearth and the radical, astonishing grace of these 2 women, Jacob and Eleanor looked at each other, and for the first time, they were no longer hiding. The first light of dawn was a shy, gray whisper at the window, painting the rough-hewn walls of the bedroom in shades of pearl and charcoal. Eleanor woke slowly, adrift in a sea of sensations she hadn't felt in years. The first was warmth, a deep, radiating heat along her entire back. The second was weight, a solid, muscular arm draped protectively over her waist, a hand resting on her hip as if it had found its rightful place. The third was the slow, steady rhythm of a heartbeat against her shoulder blades, a sound that was at once profoundly strange and deeply comforting. She did not move. She lay perfectly still, her eyes closed, trying to anchor herself to this new reality. This was Jacob's bed. This was his arm around her, his breath stirring her hair. The memory of the previous night flooded back not as a series of distinct events, but as a tide of overwhelming emotion. The raw honesty of his confession, the astonishing grace of Clara's sacrifice, the quiet, powerful benediction of Ruth's touch. It had been a night of shattering walls, of terrifying vulnerability that had somehow led not to ruin, but to this quiet, impossible peace. She dared to open her eyes. Jacob was still asleep, his face in repose softer and younger than she had ever seen it. The hard lines of vigilance and sorrow were smoothed away, leaving only a weary peace, A great swelling tenderness rose in her chest, so powerful it almost hurt to breathe. This man, this silent, solitary soldier, had carried his wounds for so long. Then she felt a slight pressure against her leg. She shifted her gaze downward. At the foot of the large bed, curled up on a thick bear hide rug, were the two sisters. Clara was fast asleep, her golden hair a tangle on the dark fur, her face as peaceful as a child's. She was lying on her side, and one of her hands was outstretched, her fingers laced through Ruth's. Ruth was awake, her calm. Gray eyes were open, watching the dawnlight creep into the room. She was not looking at Jacob or Eleanor. She was looking at her sister's sleeping face, a look of fierce, boundless love in her expression. When she felt Eleanor's gaze, she turned her head slightly. She offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent affirmation that said, "Yes, this is real. We are all here." In that moment, Eleanor understood. This was not a victory for one woman over another. It was a surrender, a mutual surrender to a truth that was larger and more complex than any of them had understood. They had not formed a line, but a circle, and in it, for the first time, everyone was safe. The news hit Salvation's Ridge like a flash flood. It started with Silas Croft, who, upon finding himself denied his blackmail money, began to drink heavily and talk loudly in the saloon. He didn't have to tell the whole truth. He only had to plant the seeds. He spoke of the strange friendship between the widow and the spinster. He hinted that Jacob, the stoic rancher, was keeping a veritable harem out on his land. The seeds fell on fertile ground. Mrs. Henderson and her sewing circle took the rumors and embroidered them with righteous fury. The image of Eleanor and Ruth at the market, their shared smiles and knowing looks, was reinterpreted as evidence of a sinful conspiracy. The fact that Eleanor, the cursed widow, now seemed to be living openly at the ranch with Jacob and his new wife and her sister, was an abomination that defied all Christian decency. By Sunday, the whispers had become a roar. Reverend Michael stood at his pulpit, his face a thunderous mask of indignation. He did not name names, but everyone knew who he was talking about. He preached of Sodom and Gomorrah, of the sickness of sin that could infect a community if it was not cut out like a cancer. He spoke of the sanctity of marriage, a holy union between one man and one woman, and the depravity of those who would defile it. The congregation murmured their fervent amens, their eyes turning toward the empty pew where Clara was supposed to have been sitting. The town, which had once been content to merely isolate Eleanor, now craved to punish her. They were no longer just shunning a woman of ill repute. They were defending their way of life against an incomprehensible threat. A delegation of the town's most prominent men, led by the Reverend himself, declared that Jacob and his household must be brought before the circuit judge on his next visit. They would be tried for immorality, for indecency, for flouting the laws of God and man. The 4 inhabitants of the ranch were an island in this sea of outrage. They felt the shift immediately. When Jacob rode into town for supplies, men who had once nodded to him now turned their backs. The mercantile owner sold him what he needed, but his manner was cold, and he slapped the coins down on the counter as if they were tainted. No one would meet his eye. The pressure from the outside had the opposite effect of what the town intended. Instead of splintering them, it fused them together. They were no longer 4 separate individuals navigating a strange arrangement. They were a single entity, a family, under siege. The true test came a few nights later. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, and a bitter wind was rattling the windows of the ranch house. A sudden, frantic whinny from the barn jolted them from their quiet evening by the fire. Jacob was on his feet in an instant, his soldier's instincts taking over. "Stay here," he commanded, grabbing a heavy rifle from the rack by the door. But none of them listened. As he ran toward the barn, the 3 women were right behind him, carrying lanterns. A flickering orange glow was beginning to illuminate the barn from within, and the terrifying smell of smoke and burning hay filled the air. "He set the barn on fire," Eleanor cried, her heart seizing with panic. As they reached the great doors, a figure burst out. Silhouetted against the growing flames, it was Silas Croft, his face a mask of drunken malice. In one hand, he held a lantern, and in the other, a burning torch. "If I can't have my money, then none of you will have anything," he screamed, his voice wild and unhinged. He threw the torch toward the house, but it fell short, sputtering in the damp earth. Jacob didn't hesitate. He didn't raise the rifle. He lunged forward, tackling Silas and sending them both sprawling into the mud. The two men wrestled, a tangle of limbs and grunted curses. "The horses!" Ruth yelled, her voice cutting through the chaos. She and Clara ran to the side door of the barn, struggling to pull it open against the heat. Eleanor grabbed a bucket and ran to the water pump, her movements frantic but purposeful. Ruth and Clara managed to get the door open, and a cloud of thick, acrid smoke billowed out. The horses were screaming in terror, their eyes wide and white. Ruth, fearless, plunged into the smoke, grabbing the halter of the nearest horse and pulling it toward the door. As she led the panicked animal out, a heavy, burning rafter from the hayloft above gave a loud crack and fell, striking her on the shoulder and sending her stumbling to the ground. Clara screamed and ran to her side, trying to drag her away from the burning entrance. Eleanor, seeing what had happened, dropped her bucket and rushed to help. Together, they pulled the groaning Ruth to safety just as the rest of the loft gave way in a shower of sparks and flame. By the time the fire was at its peak, Jacob had subdued Silas. He had the man pinned to the ground, his forearm pressed against his throat. Silas's face was purple, his eyes bulging with terror. For a moment, Jacob's face was a mask of cold, murderous rage. Every instinct honed on the battlefield screamed at him to finish it, to eliminate the threat, to exact vengeance for the harm done to his home, to his family. He could feel Silas's life fluttering beneath his arm, a fragile thing he could extinguish with a single, final surge of pressure. But then he heard Eleanor's voice cry out Ruth's name in fear. He saw Clara, her face streaked with soot and tears, trying to tend to her sister's injured shoulder. And he knew that killing this pathetic, drunken man would solve nothing. It would only bring more violence, more darkness into the small circle of light they were trying to build. Vengeance was an ending. He needed a beginning. He eased the pressure, hauling Silas to his feet. "It's over," he said, his voice ragged. He bound Silas's hands with a piece of rope from the corral, his movements efficient and final. He would not kill him. He would hand him over to the law, but not just for the arson. "I was a soldier in the 17th Infantry," Jacob said, his voice low and cold as he pushed Silas toward the house. "We were stationed near the mining territories in '82. I remember hearing about a clerk from the C&V mining office who disappeared the same night the company payroll did. A man named Silas Croft. They said he killed a guard to get it." Silas's drunken bravado evaporated, replaced by a stark, sober terror. "That's a lie! You can't prove anything!" "Maybe," Jacob said, his voice grim. "But a federal marshal might be very interested to hear my story, and to see the fancy suit you're wearing." The arrival of the circuit judge a week later was a tense affair. The entire town of Salvation's Ridge seemed to be crammed into the small meeting hall that served as a courtroom. They were there for a spectacle, to see the sinners cast out, but they were to be disappointed. The judge was a weary, pragmatic man named Elias Thorne, who had seen every kind of human folly the West had to offer. He dealt with Silas Croft first. Jacob presented his testimony, and a telegram from the territorial marshal confirmed that a man matching Silas's description was indeed wanted for robbery and murder. Silas was clapped in irons and sent away to face federal justice, his chapter in their lives brutally and efficiently closed. Then, Judge Thorne turned to the matter of Jacob's household. Reverend Michael, speaking for the town, delivered an impassioned speech about morality and public decency. He described the living arrangement as an affront to God, a source of corruption that threatened the moral fabric of their community. When he was finished, the judge turned his tired eyes to the four of them, standing together before him. "Mr. Jacob," he said, his voice dry, "is your wife, Mrs. Clara Jacob, here of her own free will?"
"She is, Your Honor,"
Jacob said. The judge looked at Clara. "Is that true, madam? Are you being held against your will? Have you been coerced in any way?" Clara stepped forward, her chin held high. "I am here by my own choice. Your Honor, I am treated with nothing but kindness and respect. I am not coerced, and I have not been harmed." The judge then looked at Ruth and Eleanor in turn. "And you, ladies? Are you being held against your will? Has any harm come to you in this arrangement?" "No, Your Honor," Ruth said, her voice clear and steady. Her arm was in a sling, a visible testament to the recent violence, but her spirit was unbroken. "No, Your Honor," Eleanor echoed, her voice quiet but firm. Judge Thorne leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers, looking at the furious faces of the town delegation. "Reverend," he said with a sigh, "I am a servant of the law, not a custodian of public morality. The law is concerned with coercion, with theft, with violence, with harm. I have found no evidence of any of these things here. I find no legal grounds to intervene in the private domestic arrangements of these individuals. However unconventional they may seem, there is no case to be made. They are free to live as they see fit." A gasp of outrage went through the crowd. The verdict was a legal victory, but it was a declaration of social war. The law might not condemn them, but the town would. The retribution was swift and merciless. Eleanor went to her cabin to collect her things, intending to reopen her seamstress business from the ranch, only to find the windows broken and the word Jezebel painted in crude red letters on her door. It was clear she could no longer work in this town. Clara, when she tried to attend Sunday service, was met at the door by Reverend Michael himself, who quietly but firmly informed her that she was no longer welcome in the house of God. Ruth, the quiet, steadfast sister, became the subject of the most vicious rumors of all, whispers of unnatural affections, of a depravity that was somehow even worse than simple adultery. They were exiles in their own home. They had won their freedom, but lost their world. It was Ruth who proposed the solution. "We cannot stay here," she said one evening, as they sat around the table in the ranch house, the weight of the town's hatred pressing in on them. "This house, this land, it is too close to them. We will never have peace." She pointed to the foothills in the distance, a wild, unclaimed stretch of land that rose toward the high peaks. "There is an old trapper's cabin up there. It's small, but it's on a piece of land no one has claimed. We could move there, build a new life, on our own terms." And so they did. They packed what they could onto a single wagon: tools, seeds, fabrics, books, and the few personal treasures they possessed. They left the large ranch house to the ghosts of their old lives and made the arduous journey up into the foothills. The cabin was small and rough, but it was solid, and it sat beside a clear, running creek. The land around it was fertile. Here, beyond the sight and judgment of Salvation's Ridge, they began to build their world anew. They planted a large garden, kept chickens, and Jacob hunted for meat. Eleanor set up her sewing machine by the cabin's largest window and made all of their clothes. Ruth, with a surprising knowledge of herbs, became their healer and cook. Clara, whose hands had once been soft and useless, became strong, tending the garden with a fierce, protective love. Their lives fell into a new rhythm, one dictated by the seasons and their shared needs, not by the bells of the town church. Each night, one of the three women would cook dinner. Each morning, they would sit on the small porch, drinking tea or coffee as the sun rose over the valley, talking and laughing. And Jacob no longer slept alone in a cold bed. Some nights, Eleanor's head rested on his shoulder. On others, he would wake to find Clara had slipped in beside him, seeking not passion, but the simple, profound comfort of a warm body in the darkness. Often, he would wake in the morning to find all three of them in the room, curled in a tangle of limbs and blankets, a knot of humanity tied against the cold loneliness of the world. In these moments, under the vast, indifferent sky of the West, they were no longer a soldier, a mail-order bride, a spinster, or a widow. Those were the labels of a world that had rejected them. Here, in the quiet of their mountain sanctuary, they were simply people who had found each other in the dark and had been brave enough to hold on until the morning. The first winter in the foothills was not a season, it was a siege. It came down from the high peaks not as a gentle blanket of snow, but as an invading army of ice and wind. The world shrank, the vibrant greens and browns of autumn buried under a monolithic, unforgiving white. The cheerful chatter of the creek was silenced, frozen in its bed. For the small family in the trapper's cabin, it was a time of testing, a crucible that would either forge them into something unbreakable or shatter them completely. Their preparations, made with the frantic energy of their first autumn, now seemed meager. The stores of dried vegetables and salted meat in their small root cellar dwindled at an alarming rate. Jacob's hunts became longer, more arduous, and less fruitful. The deer and elk retreated to the high sheltered valleys, and he would return after a full day of tracking in the blinding snow with nothing but a few rabbits, his face etched with exhaustion and the beginnings of a deep, gnawing worry. The woodpile, which had looked like a mountain in October, was now a mere hillock. Each log burned a precious resource against a cold that was a physical entity, a predator that clawed at the chinking of their cabin and rattled the shutters. The first casualty of the siege was Ruth. The injury she had sustained in the barn fire had never fully healed. A deep, angry scar marked her shoulder, and the punishing labor of their new life had kept it from mending properly. Now, the bitter, damp cold seeped into the old wound, into her very bones. It started as a deep ache, then a persistent cough that rattled her thin frame. By the time the snow was waist-deep outside their door, the cough had turned into a fever that left her shivering uncontrollably one moment and burning with a dry, consuming heat the next. She, who had been their quiet, unshakable center of gravity, was now utterly helpless. She lay on a small cot pulled close to the hearth, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The calm, all-seeing light in her gray eyes was clouded with delirium, and she would murmur of green fields in Ohio, of her mother's garden, of people and places that were a world away. Her illness plunged the small cabin into a new kind of silence, a tense, fearful quiet punctuated by the sound of her labored breathing. Their struggle was no longer just against the wilderness outside. It was against the specter of death within their own walls. Eleanor became her nurse. All the patience and meticulous attention to detail she had once poured into her sewing, she now channeled into the desperate task of keeping Ruth alive. She was a constant presence at the cot, her face pale with exhaustion but her hands steady. She bathed Ruth's burning forehead with snowmelt, forcing spoonfuls of thin broth between her cracked lips. She remembered the herbs Ruth had gathered in the autumn, the ones she'd hung to dry from the rafters for this very purpose. She brewed teas from yarrow to fight the fever and made poultices of mullein for the relentless cough, her movements guided by a fierce, protective love and the desperate hope that Ruth's own wisdom would be enough to save her. While Eleanor tended to the body, Clara tended to the soul. The fragile, frightened girl she had once been was gone, burned away in the fires of the last few months. In her place was a woman of quiet, formidable strength. She took over all of Ruth's duties without a word of complaint, her small hands, now calloused and capable, managing the cooking, the mending, the rationing of their precious food. But her greatest contribution was an act of quiet devotion. Every evening, after the day's work was done, she would sit by the fire, her needle and thread flashing in the flickering light. She was embroidering a series of small linen cloths, her stitches impossibly fine and intricate. Each one was a different scene from a world Ruth could no longer see. A spray of bluebells, a soaring hawk, a rising sun. Every morning, Clara would replace the cloth from the night before, placing the new one on the small table beside Ruth's bed, a silent offering of beauty and hope, a message to her sister that the world was still waiting for her. Jacob became their shield, their provider, the sinew that held them all together. He waged a solitary war against the winter. He would leave before dawn, his rifle on his shoulder, and return long after dark, his body a study in exhaustion. He chopped wood until his hands, chapped and raw from the cold, split and bled, staining the axe handle a dark, frozen red. He would come into the cabin, his beard caked with ice, and his first glance would always be to the cot by the fire, his eyes asking the question his lips could not form. He would watch Eleanor tend to Ruth, a look of profound, helpless anguish on his face. He could fight a blizzard. He could track a deer for 20 miles. He could face down a man with a torch, but against this invisible enemy, this sickness, he was powerless, and it ate at him, hollowing him out from the inside. One night, the wind howled like a legion of grieving souls, and the fever was at its worst. Ruth was tossing in a fitful delirium, her hands plucking at the quilt. Eleanor sat beside her, her head bowed in exhaustion, her heart a cold, heavy stone of fear. She had done everything she knew how to do. It was not enough. Suddenly, Ruth's eyes opened. The feverish glaze was gone. They were clear, lucid, and fixed on Eleanor's face. Her voice, when she spoke, was a dry, rasping whisper, but it was her own. "Eleanor," she breathed. Eleanor's head shot up. "Ruth, I'm here. I'm right here." Ruth's gaze was steady, filled with a deep, sorrowful clarity. She looked past Eleanor for a moment, toward the corner where Jacob sat silently cleaning his rifle, his movements a desperate attempt to keep his hands from being idle. Then her eyes returned to Eleanor. "You," Ruth whispered, her breath hitching. "You are the one who keeps him alive." She paused, gathering her strength. "I am only the one who helps you not be lonely." The words, so simple, so true, struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. They were not a confession of defeat, but a statement of profound, selfless love. In that moment, Ruth was not just defining her own role. She was giving Eleanor a gift, the gift of understanding their circle, of seeing the beautiful, intricate geometry of their love, the carefully constructed dam of Eleanor's composure, which had held back weeks of fear and exhaustion, finally broke. A great, shuddering sob escaped her, and she buried her face in the rough quilt, her tears hot and cleansing. A gentle hand came to rest on her shoulder. She looked up through her tears to see Clara standing beside her, her blue eyes soft with a wisdom that belied her years. She had been standing in the shadows, a silent witness to the exchange. She looked from the weeping Eleanor to the exhausted but lucid Ruth on the cot. Her hand on Eleanor's shoulder was firm, a small anchor in the storm. "We are one," Clara said, her voice quiet but absolute. It was not a comfort. It was a creed. It was the fundamental truth of their existence, spoken aloud in the darkest hour of the night. Eleanor looked at Clara's determined face, then at Ruth's faint, approving smile, and she understood. Her tears were not just for the fear of losing Ruth. They were for the overwhelming miracle of having found them both. From that night, the tide began to turn. The fever did not break immediately, but its grip lessened. Ruth began to take more broth, to sleep more peacefully. Her recovery was a slow, arduous journey, mirroring the slow retreat of the winter itself. The first sign of hope came not from the cot, but from outside the window. One morning, they woke to a new sound, the gentle, persistent drip of melting snow from the eaves. Spring arrived tentatively, in small, shy increments. A patch of bare earth appeared on the south-facing slope. The creek began to whisper beneath its sheath of ice. Then one day, a lone robin appeared on a pine branch, its cheerful song a defiant proclamation against the silence of the snow. As Ruth's strength returned, so did the life of the world around them. Soon she was able to sit up, wrapped in a thick quilt, by the open cabin door, her face turned toward the pale, watery sunlight. One bright, clear afternoon, when the last of the snow had shrunk to stubborn patches in the deepest shadows, the three women stood together on the small porch. The air was clean and cold, but it held the unmistakable promise of new growth. Below them, in the small corral, Jacob was on the roof of the lean-to that served as their stable, hammering a loose shingle back into place. The rhythmic, purposeful sound was a sound of life, of rebuilding. They watched him in a comfortable, shared silence. He was their husband, their partner, their protector. He was the center of their small universe, the axis around which they all turned. Clara, her eyes fixed on his broad back as he worked, spoke in a voice that was almost a whisper, as if speaking a thought directly from her soul. "We went beyond the limits," she said, her gaze distant. "Beyond the laws of the town, beyond the words in the Bible. But because of that, we also crossed the boundaries of prejudice. Their walls couldn't hold us." Eleanor turned to look at her, at this young woman who had offered a sacrifice so profound, and saw a serene strength in her face. The bitterness was gone, replaced by a deep and quiet understanding. Eleanor smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. It was the smile of a woman who was finally, truly, home. Ruth, leaning on Eleanor for support but standing on her own 2 feet for the first time in months, reached out. She took Eleanor's hand in one of hers, and Clara's in the other. Their 3 hands, so different. Eleanor's nimble and scarred from her needle, Clara's small and strong from the garden, Ruth's thin and pale from her illness. Clasped together, the warmth of the spring sun fell upon them, illuminating them. 3 distinct figures united as one. In that light, no one was a shadow, no one was a ghost of what might have been. They were all present, all real, all whole. The story of their lives settled into a new chapter, one of peace and quiet joy. The end of their days were often spent on the porch, watching the sun set, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. On one such evening, the 3 women sat in their rocking chairs, their hands busy with their knitting, the soft click-clack of the needles a gentle, rhythmic counterpoint to the evening bird song. Jacob came out of the cabin, carrying a wooden tray with 4 steaming bowls of stew. He set it down on a small table between them. He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he stood behind them, placing a hand on Eleanor's shoulder, and his other on Clara's. Ruth reached up and placed her hand over his. He looked out at the valley below, at the world that had cast them out, and then he looked at the 3 women who were his world now. He smiled, a slow, genuine smile of a man who had finally found peace. And as the last rays of the sun bathed them in a golden light, they all began to laugh, a soft, shared sound of pure contentment that echoed in the vast, quiet twilight of the American West. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more tales, and share your thoughts on the journey of Eleanor, Jacob, Clara, and Ruth.